Okay, we're now going to go back to the first book that we looked at. Okay, we're going to talk about debugging a Visual Basic program. And first we're going to talk about the different types of errors. We're going to classify errors into one of three types of errors, basically. And we're going to use Visual Studio debugging tools to set breakpoints and correct mistakes. Well, we did that a little bit, I think, last week. And we're also going to learn about the autos and watch windows. And we saw the immediate window before, so this is similar. And a few other things. So he says, in the past few chapters you've had plenty of opportunity to make programming mistakes in your code. Right? I'm sure we've all made some mistakes and we couldn't figure out what was the problem at first. Maybe finally we figured it out. He says, unlike human conversation, which usually works well despite occasional grammatical mistakes and mispronunciations, communication between a software developer and the Microsoft Visual Basic compiler is successful only when precise rules and regulations of the Visual Basic programming language are followed. Okay, so we have to be much more careful than when we're just speaking. So we're going to talk about three different types of errors. So he says three types of errors can occur in Visual Basic program: syntax error, runtime errors, and logic errors. So let's see the difference. A syntax error, or compiler error, is a mistake such as a misspelled property or misspelled keyword that violates the programming rules of Visual Basic. Visual Basic will point out several, or Visual Studio will point out several types of syntax errors in your programs while you enter program statements, and it won't let you run a program until you fix each syntax error. So you've seen those. That's when you get those squiggly lines underneath some word, and it tells you that it won't compile until you fix that. Now there were actually different colors for those squiggly lines, and we're going to talk about the meaning of the different colors. Okay, but those are called syntax errors. Let's just look up this word syntax in the dictionary. This is a dictionary. Definition of syntax: the way in which linguistic elements, like words, are put together to form constituent phrases or clauses. So it's the way that you have to the way that you have to form words to make sense in a certain language. And it's also the part of the language dealing with this. 2, a connected or orderly system, harmonious arrangement of parts or elements. Okay, so that's basically what we mean by syntax. So it's how we have to, the rules that we have to follow in order to create a successful expression in Visual Basic. Okay, the next type of error is called a runtime error, and that's a mistake that causes a program to stop unexpectedly during execution. So if you don't correct the syntax errors, you'll never get to see a runtime error because the program won't even compile, so you can't even run it. But if you correct all the syntax errors, you still might get a runtime error. Runtime errors occur when an outside event or an undiscovered syntax error forces a program to stop while it's running. For example, or for instance, if you misspell a file name when you use the system drawing image from file, I think we used this before, and we want to pick up a file and read it, and we have the name of the file, and so we're going to go and pick it up and open it. But if you misspell the file name, now the compiler is not going to know that you misspelled the file name, right? So it's not going to catch that kind of error. But you're still going to get an error when you try and run the program if you're referencing a particular file that doesn't exist because you've misspelled it. Okay, so that's going to be called a runtime error. It's not going to happen until the program is actually running and it looks for this file which doesn't exist. Another example is if you try to read the floppy drive, or let's say the flash drive, and it doesn't contain, if you're trying to read a flash drive and it's not plugged into the computer. Okay, so that will also generate a runtime error. Okay, so these are some examples of runtime errors. Okay, so we have syntax errors, which are we're not using the grammar of the Visual Basic language properly. And then even if we do use the grammar of the Visual Basic language properly, we might be referencing things, for example, on the desktop or somewhere that aren't there. Or we might be referencing a whole folder that's not there. Or we might be referencing a floppy drive, or I'm sorry, a flash drive that's not there. Okay, those are called runtime errors. And then we have logic errors. And that's something that causes the program code to produce the wrong results. What that means is, like, you have a program that's supposed to calculate the amount that you need to pay for taxes, and you as the programmer put the wrong percentage into the program. So maybe you put 5% for sales tax in Japan, but maybe the law has changed and now it's 8%. So that's another kind of error that the program is making. Now that's not going to get caught by the program at all. So it's just going to give you an answer for the amount that you have to pay, and you're just going to use that answer, but you're going to have the wrong answer. So that kind of error is called a logic error. So they call it a human error. A mistake that causes the program code to produce the wrong results. Most debugging efforts are focused on tracking down logic errors introduced by the programmer. So first he says that if you encounter a syntax error, that's the first type of error, you can often solve the problem by using the Visual Studio documentation, or actually we can use IntelliSense, to learn more about the error message. You can fix the mistake by paying close attention to the exact syntax of the functions, objects, methods, and properties that you have used. In the code editor, incorrect statements are underlined with a jagged line, and you can learn more about the error by holding the mouse pointer over the statement, and you'll see a little message, right? We've seen that. You've seen that many times. The illustration on the following page shows the error message that appears in Visual Studio when I type the word case using incorrectly as CSAE, and then hold the mouse pointer over the error. This error message appears as a screen tip. So you can see that he spelt it wrong. He puts the mouse over here and it says name this is not declared. So that might make you realize you didn't mean to declare anything here. You were just using a keyword, and so you might realize that you misspelled it. And you can also see there's an a jagged underline there. He says by default a green jagged line indicates a warning. So a warning is different than an error. An error, a warning is not necessarily an error. And the program will probably compile if it's just a warning. So if it's a green jagged line, the program will probably compile. So that's what a green jagged line will mean. A red jagged line indicates now I'm not absolutely sure that these still hold. This was for 2008. I assume that it's still true for 2010 and the later versions as well. But let's just read it. A red jagged line indicates a syntax error. A blue jagged line indicates a compiler error, and a purple jagged line indicates some other error. Okay, let's continue. Okay, next thing he talks about is a little bit about a runtime error. If you encounter a runtime error, you can often address the problem by correcting your typing. For example, if a bitmap or a picture loads incorrectly into a picture box, the problem might simply be a misspelled path or an incorrect path. However, many runtime errors require a more thorough solution. You can add what's called structured error handler, a special block of program code that recognizes a runtime error when it happens, suppresses any error messages, and adjusts program conditions to handle the problem to your programs. He discusses the new syntax for structured error handlers in Chapter 9, trapping errors by using structured error handling. So we'll look at that. Okay, now he talks about logic errors, and here's going to be an example of a logic error. If age is greater than 13 and age is less than 20, then we're going to put into text box 2, you're a teenager, and else you're not a teenager. But we can see there's a certain problem with this, because if someone's 13, this will be will not say you're a teenager, but actually they are a teenager. So we call that a logic error. Now he says here, believe it or not, this type of mistake is the most common problem in a Visual Basic program. Code that produces expected results most of the time, but not all of the time, is the hardest to test and to fix. Okay, I'm going to use Visual Studio. On this computer I have Visual Studio 2008 Express, so I'm going to use that for a demonstration here. So Debugging 101, using debugging mode. One way to identify a logic error is to execute your program one line at a time and examine the content of one or more variables. So examine the content of the variables or properties as they change. So you can sort of step through the code one line at a time and see what happens to each of the variables, or whatever variables you're interested in, as you step through the code one line at a time. To do this, you can enter the debugging mode or break mode while your program is running, and then view your code in the code editor. Debugging mode gives you a close-up look at your program while the Visual Basic compiler is executing it. It's kind of like pulling up a chair behind the pilot and the co-pilot when you're in an airplane and watching them fly the airplane. So you sit behind the pilot and you can watch them fly. You sit behind the program, you can watch it run. But in this case you can touch the controls. While you're debugging your application, you'll use buttons on the standard toolbar, and we'll show the debug toolbar as well, and special buttons and windows in the IDE. The following illustration shows the debugging buttons on the standard and debug toolbars, which you can open by pointing to the toolbars command on the view menu and then clicking standard or debug. So let's just check that. So I've got both standard and debug open now, I think. Yeah, okay. Okay, let me start again. In the following exercise you'll set a breakpoint, which is a place in the program where execution stops. So we're going to set a breakpoint. We've done that. You'll use debugging mode and find and correct the logic error you discovered earlier in the if-then structure. That's the age is 13 error. So we're going to use debugging mode to get that, to find it and correct it. To isolate the problem, you'll use the Step Into button, which will let you go step by step through the program, on the standard toolbar to execute program instructions one at a time. And you'll use the Autos window, so that's one of the windows we can look at, to examine the value of key program variables. So we want to check different variables as we go through step by step through the program, and also certain properties like text properties or whatever. Pay close attention to this debugging strategy. You can use it to correct many types of glitches in your own programs. Okay, so let's start this in the next video. So what you can do is create this form. Okay, so you can stop the video and create this form, and then you can show you can have this text here. So we have this error. We're going to try and find it using the debugging techniques. And also we have this button. Does it work? I think it works actually. Maybe not. I'm not sure if it works. Let's see. Yeah, it works. Okay. So you can have this also. Okay. Okay, so why don't you create this form and then we'll go through it.